If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Dr. Poonam Madar, and her work focuses on the lived experiences of Black British men, particularly Black British men living in London. Poonam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matthew. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. I gave you a little bit of an introduction, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, so I've been in the world of academia for at least over 20 years. Wow, that sounds really long. And only just so I've been working at universities for a while as well, but just last year I decided to take a break, and now I'm freelancing at the moment. So doing a lot of academic coaching, and spending a lot of time doing writing, which I don't feel I got to do a lot of when I was in the world of academia at the time, especially because teaching took up a lot of time. But yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Excellent. How's freelance? That's a scary world.
It is, but you know what? I feel sort of guilty saying this, especially at a time when what we're going through with the pandemic. I actually took time out and went away for 6 months traveling, and I only just got back in March. So the freelancing has only just started recently. So I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. It is challenging because, before the pandemic, I was kind of just very free and I was enjoying myself while I was away for 6 months. So I'm not going to complain. It'll be selfish of me to do that. So for now, I'm just going to say it's fine. I mean, if anything, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about freelancing is there's been quite a lot of people that I've been coaching who are doing their PhDs at the moment. And I think especially during this time, I think it's been of quite a lot of help to them. And I've actually enjoyed doing it as well. And I think nothing kind of beats being able to do things, in your own time, in your own way. So at the moment, I'm kind of enjoying being my own boss.
Right.
I'm not. I'll see how long it lasts, but yeah, for now it's good.
And what about the subject of sociology? Where did that all start for you?
It started during A-levels. I remember the first day in my class, our sociology teacher said, once you start studying sociology, you're never going to see the world in the same way again. And, I was, 16 years old, and you just think, okay, that just sounds a little bit too far-fetched. But, here I am many, many years later, and he was right. But yeah, I think that's what it was at that time. I think when you started studying it, you started to realize that, you start to question so many things, more so than you've ever done. But I mean, I guess the other side of it is you become someone who asks too many questions, you become the overthinker, you're over-analyzing, and so it's kind of like trying to reach that balance. But yeah, I guess since that time, it never left me. I've stuck with it ever since.
And when you were studying A-level, maybe beyond as well, who were your kind of inspirations? Was there any particular theorists or sociologists that you were passionate about?
Yeah, I think initially it started off with Foucault. I think especially when I read Discipline and Punish, and I became more curious about things around, because he writes a lot about knowledge and power and this idea of resistance. And I think I became more and more curious about it. And especially because he talked about how, you can apply this to any kind of institution, any kind of organizations. And I constantly thought about it in the context of education. And I think there was all this, how you sort of sometimes read something or someone makes a comment or there's a quote and it never leaves you. It kind of stays with you. You always remember it. And there was a quote by Foucault and it said, I don't write a book so that it will be the final word. I write a book so that other books are possible, not necessarily written by me. And I thought that was kind of quite interesting because I felt like that in itself was some kind of invitation that, if you want to enter that world and into a debate around sociology, maybe you could think about building on his own work or, whether it's supporting it or arguing against it. But yeah, he was definitely one of the first. And then after that, definitely Stuart Hall. I'm a big fan of Stuart Hall and Zygmunt Bauman's work as well. So yeah, there's others, but they were probably those three were those initial inspiration, or where I felt like, yeah, okay, I really want to kind of be more committed to this.
Yeah. So yeah, quite like the kind of more postmodern theories as well in there.
Yeah, quite a bit. Especially when I'm thinking about looking at things around identity, especially in big cities like London, I guess, which is quite a lot of what my research is based on.
Great. So let's move on to your research then. So I mentioned at the beginning, lived experiences of Black British men. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Okay. So as you said, in a nutshell, it's looking at what it feels like to be Black, British and male, and specifically in London. So I carried out this research in 2008. It was quite an interesting time, actually, because my research kind of coincided with a time in Britain where, the front page was every single day, especially of that summer in 2008. There was constant news around the concerns around knife and gun crime, gang-related activities, and, where Black males were seen as the main victims and perpetrators. And at the same time, we also saw on the other side of the pond where, Barack Obama was going on to become, the president. So it was an interesting time to even ask that question, what does it feel to be a Black British male? And, the men that I interviewed, I used visual methods, so photo elicited interviews to ask that question. And it was quite interesting because, we're using images to kind of ask how they might respond to images that are put out there of black masculinities in popular culture, but also how they themselves used images to kind of give a glimpse of their own identities. And I think, especially during that time, you didn't have things like social media. You didn't have Instagram or, people constantly putting out images of themselves out there. So at that time, it was an interesting way to kind of just understand how they used images to kind of show how they felt about what it felt like being in Britain or being a Londoner more so.
So what sort of methodology were you using? Was it interview based?
It was interview based. I carried out the interviews. I also did a survey. I did quite a few things. So I went to a lot of sort of events where I could just meet people from that particular background. I went to a lot of events that also involved how the concerns were around, what does it feel like to be Black? And not just Black and male, but also just the concerns that sort of like certain Black communities had at the time towards the way that in which they were being portrayed in the media. But most of the time, it's all qualitative based research mostly. So interviews and using photographs as a way to carry out those interviews. So I'm quite big on visual methodologies.
And the men themselves, what sort of age group? Was it younger men you were talking to?
Yeah, I would say so between 18 and 45. So it's a little wide spectrum, but adults, yeah.
So from what you said so far, was the overwhelming feeling that the media representation was one of a negative? Yeah,
I think also this is something that's a long-going debate. It was that, but it was also, it's always a very skewed and simplistic version of a certain group of people. There's never sort of like a complete diverse representation. It's also about the certain arguments that are constantly put out there that happen to be sort of like being regurgitated time and time and time again. And that, you need kind of more voices to kind of, maybe offer alternative opinions. And it's not like they're not there. It's just that they don't necessarily have the platform in which to express it. But, I think at the time in which I was doing it, I think at that time, maybe there was less opportunities for people to be able to express that. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily as much the case now. I mean, people are using social media to kind of put things out there in their views. I think we have a lot more now. But yeah, at that time particularly, that was definitely the general feeling.
So you mentioned that images were quite often simplified or stereotyped. What were the main representations of black males that were being seen?
So the typical ones would be particularly linked to music, whether it's as a gifted dancer or a music artist, or in relation to sports. And if it wasn't sports, then it was some connection to crime, and specific crime, like street crime, I guess. So, knife and gun crime, as I said, or gang-related activities.
It's interesting you just mentioned about the sports. There's been quite a lot in the media recently about the words or language that's used when describing footballers. Quite often white footballers classified as an intelligent player. And quite often the words used with black players are powerful, strong, or even he's a beast, those sort of words. And that seems quite true, doesn't it? Even from as far back as your research in 2008, and it doesn't seem to have changed that much, actually.
No, you're right. And, I think one of the things that really stuck out for me when I was doing my research was that, a few of the respondents said to me that, they said, look, without sounding, and it's not to sound negative in any way, it's just kind of giving this sort of realistic thing that even in 2008, we're sitting there and they're having this conversation, and they, a couple of the respondents said the same thing, that there are certain ways in which black men will be described, like in sports, as you've given that example. And they were like, you can take it to like maybe fast forward 5-10 years and that same conversation will still be happening. It doesn't kind of change. So I think that it's still quite, it's still there, but it's very difficult to kind of like take sort of those views that have been regurgitated time and time again, and to sort of hope that they are obviously always being challenged, but it's just, how does it come to kind of a stop?
Because the other thing that I've spoken to a few people that I've interviewed that have talked about black males being kind of hypersexualized as well, particularly through pornography or the way in which they're viewed in the mass media. Was that something that you identified as well?
There was discussion about that as well, but not like to a great deal. Like at the time, there was all sorts of different ways in which there was this notion around hypersexuality, especially when it's connected to music or even in sports. But there were other discussions taking place as well, in particular, like the kind of experiences that they might have, whether it's in education or in employment. So, that was just sort of like one aspect of what we discussed. It wasn't something that was just the only thing. But yeah, we also talked about sort of like how they might feel, as in a lot of it was based on about growing up in London and what that kind of felt like. So also about how they connect to other social groups, and things that have changed over time, things that obviously have improved or things that have been better, and some things that are still kind of work in progress.
Thank you. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll carry on discussing about the research. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Poonam Madar. You mentioned a couple of areas that I'd like to explore a little bit more, education and employment. Can we start with education? What was the experiences for many black males in relation to education?
It was a mixed reaction. Some, talked about how they had a good experience in school. Some talked it wasn't so positive. I think it was a lot of the feeling generally was that within the school environment, especially in the case if it was predominantly made up of teachers that were not so diverse, and I mean like ethnically diverse or even in terms of gender, there was always this sense of that you're not quite sure how you fit in or you don't. And sort of that, and that kind of is the first place where you kind of pick up on how you might start to feel this sense of difference. And then it's something that kind of might trickle on towards things like employment and so on. But there was also this thing of nothing ever quite stays the same. That, you know, you it's sort of like you can see sort of like maybe your own educational experience might not be so positive, but you can see how later it kind of improves. Maybe if you end up going to college or maybe at university, it's kind of really difficult to kind of just pinpoint the general feeling because they all had such kind of different range of experiences. So I can't narrow it down to saying that, you know, they all felt this.
One of the areas that I'm really interested in, I don't know if you experienced this, I spoke to Professor Gary Young, and he said for many young black people living in England, or Britain, I should say, even if they're British born and bred, they go on this kind of journey in terms of trying to discover their roots or with the heritage, that there's almost kind of this conflict between being British but also their heritage as well. Was that anything that you identified?
Yeah, to some extent there was. But you know what I found really interesting was that rather than using the word so much British, there was almost like this sense of I'm a Londoner. And I think that's very different as well, to some extent. There was almost this sense of pride as well, that I'm a Londoner. So I think that is something that's always, I think, is worth exploring as well, because sometimes you often hear people say things like, oh, it's a London thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and that can be positive or negative. I don't know, but in the context of the men that I interviewed, there was something very positive about being I'm a Londoner, and sometimes it was also very specific. Like I'm a South Londoner, and I celebrate that. So I'm not sure if it was so much of a conflict, but it was almost like recognizing that that, you know, there's a part of me that rejoices this thing of being a Londoner, but there is also these connections of wanting to understand history and my roots as well. And they're all kind of tied up in one. So it's not quite simple as just, you know, this, but yeah, that's one of the things that I really picked up on, this thing of like, yeah, being proud of being a Londoner, you know, and that can just mean a whole host of things.
Yeah, I mean, the lyrics in a song, aren't they? It's a
London. Yeah, it's a London thing, and I think that's something that really stood out in my research, that it's a London thing, and I thought that was, yeah, it was quite an interesting element, which I'm looking to kind of explore more. Yeah. So yeah,
even the kind of the areas as you said, I mean, another lyric, I'm so London, I'm so South, you know, yeah. that importance of not just being a Londoner, but also which area of London.
Yeah, I sometimes get that when people say, oh, you know, you're from West, and it's like, oh, but it's not South, so you're not quite cool. And it's just like, okay, so there's a certain thing that's associated with South as well. But, you know, I'm still learning.
I suppose it's all part of identity, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think there was interesting in the ways in which, you know, you kind of like navigate these spaces of your own identity as well in London. Like there's certain places where you might feel, yeah, you can express it in certain ways, and other ways, you know, you might not feel that. I suppose those spaces in which you feel you can experience more inclusion, and other spaces where you feel more excluded. So it's kind of like it's a very complex relationship.
Let's move on to employment then. You mentioned experience of employment as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think what was interesting was that I think for a long time there might have been lots of debates about, you know, education is probably the most difficult aspect. Especially for a lot of young Black people. But in my research, I also found that sometimes the employment sector was far more difficult. And quite a few of the men that I interviewed kind of felt that if you're going to be in an environment, whether it be in an office or something else, where you kind of feel that you are going to experience forms of racism, there's almost this temptation to think that, well, you know, what other kind of opportunities am I going to carve out for myself? That where I don't have to necessarily experience all of this. And so there were a lot of guys when I interviewed them that were actually looking to kind of branch out and become, you know, self-employed, so that they wouldn't have to experience it, and almost working for themselves, being their own boss. But, you know, I think that's also, I mean, that's great on one element, but it's also quite sort of, you know, it's got that kind of sad tone to it, that you feel that you would need to do that because of the racism that you do experience within the workplace. And, you know, quite often it's not necessarily obvious or in your face. It's those everyday kind of microaggressions that occur that you can't necessarily always prove. So, yeah, we talked quite a lot about that as well.
Do you mind giving an experience? Like you said, we're not talking about overt, explicit racism, but more systemic. Was there any particular examples that people experienced?
Yeah, for I think if noticing sort of things like, for example, if they, I think one particular respondent of mine mentioned that he was in a work environment where he was first of all the only black person, and he felt that he was aware that his own academic qualifications surpassed the one of his line manager and even his supervisor, and that he felt that they were still in a position where they'd been able to get a job that he hadn't been able to get. Also, just little things, and well, not little things, but just sitting in a meeting and sometimes expressing his views, and you feel that those are being undermined, whereas other people are given the more space to be able to express them. And it was just kind of like these continuous sort of everyday experiences. Say, for example, if you're in a meeting and you want to challenge something in terms of you don't necessarily agree with something, it's almost like don't say anything, because immediately, rather than someone's appreciating that you have an alternative opinion, it's more like, oh, you're difficult because you have an opinion.
Yes.
And that's where the problem is, that even to speak, there's already a label waiting for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest issue.
Yeah, I've read articles before, the language that's used if someone does challenge in a meeting, for example, that often black people are labelled with aggressive, that kind of term, as opposed to being forward or bolshy or confident.
Yeah,
Different
I mean,
language will be used.
yeah, it's different language will be used, and I've found that even in my own experience, because there will be a stereotype, maybe perhaps towards Asian women or Indian women in my case, where you have to be one or the other. So you're either more seen as submissive, where you kind of stay quiet and you just you say your yes and no and please and thank you whenever you need to, but there's the other side, which is if you speak up, then it's like, oh, she's a little bit feisty, she's a little bit different, she's got a mouth on her and things like that, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, she's different, and it's like, well, no, we're all different. It's just that you choose to use a language to kind of make us feel even more different. So yeah.
Could we explore another area? We mentioned education,
Sure.
employment. Was there any other areas that were particularly of importance?
There was a lot about the media, mainstream media. That was a big topic. This idea that many people tend to sort of take what it says on the headline, like regarding the headlines, and are happy to kind of believe the kind of general consensus of what is said about particular groups. And I guess it was looking at the relationship between media and the general public, like how many people will step back and go, okay, I'm not just going to read this and I'm actually going to question it, or I'm going to try and look for other forms of information that might contradict this. That those kind of things. It was a lot to do with also that media representation, like it's always kind of like the same kind of news is being regurgitated, and it kind of creates this feeling that, yeah, we already know what there is to know about these particular groups of people, and there's nothing more about it. So there was a lot around that.
So not much has changed since Stuart Hall's study, really, is it? Let's be honest.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I mean, there are small little changes that I think have taken place. I do, but I'm still kind of exploring them in my works. It's just, yeah, that's a tough one though. That's definitely a tough one. But yeah, there was a lot of discussion around the media. Yeah.
And you just said improvements. That's the area that I really wanted to move towards at the end here, is that what improvements have you seen in your time, and even in the 12 years since you've carried out the research?
I think one of the things that I would have, this is all really very kind of personal, but it's very subjective, I think, because I just base it on those observations, in the sense that maybe in my time, I think that even when I was at university, there was quite a lot of segregation still. And even in a lecture hall, I might have been one of very few minorities, that was sitting in the room. But I think that now, based on like me even teaching at universities, I see like a complete sort of mix. It's ethnically quite diverse. And I think that's one of the things that I've kind of felt that's changed. I also think that people have more kind of opportunity to kind of speak out about the things that they see that are wrong, that you don't necessarily feel that you had the space to do, or you didn't have the platform to do it. But I think that now, the way that people are using maybe Instagram or Twitter or so on, there are lots and lots of things that people are doing that I don't think were available before. So to that degree, and I think there's this other thing that, like I said, and I know I'm coming back to it, but it's that relationship that people experience a lot with London. There's a certain love with it as well, and I don't think that necessarily was being discussed so much in the 1970s or 80s. But things like that. There's these sort of changes that are just not obvious, that are taking place all the time. They're not obvious all the time. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, there's kind of two sides to it, isn't there? Because in terms of the awareness of even opening up the discussions about race, I mean, I just noticed in the bookshop yesterday, the top 3 selling books at the moment are all something to do with race. Why I'm no longer talking to white people.
Yeah.
About race and white fragility were in the top 2. So certainly the awareness of opening up the discussion seems to be there, doesn't it?
It does. But I don't mean to sound kind of suspicious, but it's just, I feel that it's because of, against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter movement, that certain books now are being sort of made more aware of. But these books came out beforehand, and it's only now they're at the top because it's a subject that is trending. You know how it works. The subject will be trending for a little while, then people can tend to forget about it, and then something else becomes more, fashionable, so to speak, and then it's not so much. So I'm a bit sort of wary of this. I mean, I remember when I did my research, there were a lot of people that said, oh, why do you want to do research on this? Everybody already knows what there is to do with the problems around race, and not many people are interested. So, but it was like, well, people do become interested, or aware, or show awareness only at a time when something starts to trend. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, but it's almost like it's not a trend. It's not a hashtag. It's something that is always there. I think maybe in a month or 2, I don't know what books will be at the front. I don't know what will be trending at that time. So I think that there's this thing of like, we just kind of need to be wary of it, that these things don't just come out of nowhere. They've always been there. But people seem to pick and choose when something is popular and when it's not.
Because one of the other counter arguments I've heard to this is the comedian Andrew Doyle was talking about this. He was saying his concern, I'm interested to know what you think about this, is that we've become actually obsessed with race, that we're constantly talking about everything to do with race. And he said this is obsession with whiteness at the moment and what it means to be white. Is there a negative to too much identity politics, or looking at race too much? Do you know what I mean?
I understand what you're saying.
Everything's deconstructed, that every TV program is deconstructed in terms of the makeup of the cast. And can we deconstruct or overthink some things in terms of race?
I think the problem that comes into that is that when you start looking into so many things, is it because for so long they were not being looked at all? And that's why it's a sense of like, okay, now this is too much. And I think maybe that sometimes is the problem, that you maybe ignored something or not questioned it for a very long time, and now all of a sudden there is sort of something that you see as a personal attack. But I think that quite often looking back to when we used to discuss race, it was almost seen as we discuss race, so you discuss ethnic minorities, but there was never a discussion on whiteness. And I think now, because the discussion is so much also concentrated on whiteness, then the question is, are we focusing too much on race? But that question wasn't so relevant before. And I think it's also sometimes in the context. I mean, when people make jokes around race, when it's done in terms of comedians, because it's for the sake of humor, no one thinks it's a problem so much then. But when it starts sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of like you're flipping the mirror over to, race involves all of us, and it does include whiteness. And maybe because there's been less of a discussion around whiteness up until quite, blowing up now recently, it's like everything is white as well. It's like, oh, wait a minute, but I think it can be seen like too much, but I think that it clearly needs to happen. Because I think there's a lot of things, a lot of topics that just sort of do kind of get swept under the carpet, and it is kind of out. It needs to be out there, so at least we can make up our mind where we stand.
Yeah.
I think that's important. I mean, at the end of the day, if you feel it gets too much, you can do what a lot of people do, is switch off from it. If it is too much for you, you don't have to be so involved. But I do think we are at a time where that question is being put forward to all of us. Like, where do you stand on this subject? Are you going to start by the sidelines and be quiet, or have you got something to say? But I would recommend you think before you speak, because I think sometimes that can also be a problem.
I mean, that is a problem with something like Twitter, isn't it? That it can become incredibly toxic.
Yeah.
Poonam, what are you working on at the moment?
So this is good. I'm actually not allowed to say what I'm kind of working on at the moment. Okay. Yeah, but that makes it sound like really interesting and exciting. So I shouldn't have said that maybe. But at the moment, there is some writing that I'm working on, and it is developing on my thesis. So I can say that much. But I'm working on that and hoping to kind of share that soon. And there are other bits and pieces that I've been working on, which I will also share soon on social media and so on. But it's still, I can say a little bit. It's quite focusing on, as I said, on it's a London thing, something along the lines of that. Yeah. I've
just remembered, it's Scott Garcia made that track. It just came.
Oh, really? Okay, good.
It's an old UK garage track, isn't it? Late 90s.
Oh, yeah.
It's good. It's a good tagline.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think I've heard it in adverts as well. I've seen it in adverts as well. Yeah, it's kind of something that's been repeated.
And Poonam, do you mind finishing just by telling the listeners where they can get in touch with you if they want to follow you on Twitter or find out more about your work?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter, which is at Dr. Poonam Madar. I'm on Instagram as well, which is at dr.pm. But I think if you just search for my name, you'll see it there. I'm also on LinkedIn. And my website will be out soon, which I will be sharing all the works that I've done. Yeah, I think maybe just give me about a month and a half, and something should hopefully be there. But yeah, I'm on Twitter, so you'll see me there. And or you can just through that you can get in touch with me and ask any questions that you might have.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.